My mother once told me a creepy story involving my uncle. She said that after the incident, my uncle left the country to work far away and had not come back for several years. That year, there was a small factory that mainly produced canned food in our village. My uncle was a factory worker at the time, and he was in charge of shipping and delivering goods to Asians. Every day, he also had to do the job of loading and unloading goods. He would drive the car to deliver the goods too. Although the job was quite hard and the salary was low, it was better than having to work far away and leave the homeland, so he still accepted to do this hard job. Once when the noodle harvest season approached, many people in the factory business would quit their jobs and the workforce would not be enough, so the factory arranged for my uncle to work overtime the night. From a worker, my uncle was assigned to a security guard. In fact, it was quite safe here, so it was also reassuring for him. That night, he was going to walk around the factory for a bit before going to sleep, and when he was about to return to the factory, he suddenly saw a dark figure carrying a large shovel coming up from the back of the factory. My uncle thought this person might have been a warehouse thief. He was still holding a shovel and didn't know what it was for. My uncle decided to shout at him. Unexpectedly, when the man was discovered, he threw the shovel back and jumped on the wall to escape. Looking at the figure, he looked startled, so my uncle confirmed that he might have been a thief. He ran to the wall, but the thief was quite fast. He managed to escape. In the blink of an eye, he jumped off the wall and ran away. My uncle at that time was giving chase, but had to stay and look after the factory too, so he silently scolded the stupid thief and went back to his work. I heard that my uncle had a little drink that night, so it was his habit when something didn't go right. Because of this incident with the thief, he did not dare to sleep well. Unexpectedly, in the middle of the night, he heard a strange noise outside the door. It seemed like someone was talking to him. When he opened his eyes, he saw a figure standing in front of the door. The voice wasn't very loud, so it wasn't clear what the person was saying, but there were a few words that seemed to be calling someone's name. My uncle thought that someone had come to see him because there was usually several other workers at the factory working overtime, but this time it sounded very much like a woman. Maybe the wife of a worker, my uncle thought, but this person was way different. He wondered if any woman could come to him in the middle of the night. He couldn't help but get curious, so he got up and went to the door. When he opened the door, the woman in front of his eyes was very scary to my uncle. She was definitely a woman, but she had no body. To be precise, her head was floating in the air. Her hair was green, it looked fuzzy. She was clearly a ghost. My uncle, being stunned for a long time, finally regained his senses and let out a huge scream. Even though he had alcohol in his body, he became sober immediately, like during the day. However, after shouting and screaming, he did not feel like the ghost was intending to kill him. The head of the ghost didn't hit him like he thought it would. Instead, it just hovered in front of him, with its mouth moving and a look of pain and tears rolling down its face as if begging him. But my uncle could not hear what she said. After a while, the woman turned her head. My uncle could only see the long black hair, then it drifted towards the back of the factory. Moments later, the head disappeared into the corner of the workshop. It seemed like she wanted to show my uncle something. He was usually shy, but at the time his feet seemed to be disobedient. Automatically, he followed her, or the head in that case. Reluctantly, he followed this woman's head, and at a glance, it was a narrow alley at the back of the factory area surrounded by large walls. The place was where the garbage was collected. Vegetable peels, eggshells, bones from the factory were piled up like hills. and in the heat of the summer it turned into humus, giving off a bad smell. My uncle did not dare to do anything that night. He only looked at it for a moment and then hid in his room to sleep until dawn. It was not until the following morning, when someone came to the factory to work, that my uncle found a shovel and led everyone to the garbage dump. As he had guessed, the head of a dead woman was pulled from the dump. He quickly called the police and they sealed off the scene, with the factory temporarily closed for investigation. The workers were given 2 days off from work, but the goods were still in stock, so my uncle still had to deliver these goods. About the 3rd day after the woman's head was discovered, my uncle and his boss went to the country seat to deliver the goods. Not long after leaving the factory, they saw a large group of people gathering at the riverbank, surrounded by many policemen who were investigating something. Out of curiosity, they parked their car nearby and went to the crowd to ask what was wrong. As it turned out, a person who went to exercise in the morning discovered the body of a woman floating in the river. The police were working to recover that body. After that, a person's body was picked up from the river and placed onto the bank. The body was swollen and rotten, but specifically, it had no head. My uncle had a heavy heart. Looking back, he realized that the boss's face was not good about this. And after seeing the boss like that, my uncle's heart had a bad premonition. Later, he would be right, because his boss was the very culprit of this case, and he was arrested and convicted for murder. It turned out that my uncle's boss had an affair and got this woman pregnant. Because she threatened his reputation as well as his status, he decided to do a very evil thing and kill her by decapitation. There was a year when I brought my daughter back to my hometown. Something bad happened to her. Now when I think about it again, I still feel frightened. My wife and I have been working in the city away from home for many years. It has been more than 2 or 3 years since I had the opportunity to return to my hometown to visit my parents. My parents were of course very happy to see us. They were also happy to see that their granddaughter is now grown up. Things have changed quite a bit there. The house my parents lived in originally had 2 rooms. When we returned, the one on the east side was being repaired and renovated. This time there was no room for us to stay in. My mother was going to move to my grandfather's house, but I told her to let us stay there because we didn't have to stay for long. Our family had not seen each other for a long time, so we were chatting and having a good time. After that, I let my daughter hang out with her grandparents for a while. Meanwhile, I moved my belongings to my grandfather's house. My grandfather lived there, and he died many years ago, so the house was vacant. I also very rarely mentioned him to my wife, because he was a very treacherous man when he was young. He abandoned his own wife and children mercilessly because of his mistress. Until he was too old to walk, he went back to beg my grandmother to forgive him. Although my grandmother accepted to forgive him, the family did not care about him in the end. My grandfather died of tuberculosis. That night, after all the cleaning was done, our whole family slept in the room that my grandfather used to sleep in. My daughter Nico also felt very scared when we were there. It took a lot of effort to get her to go to sleep. Then, my wife and I talked for a while before we could fall asleep. Around midnight, Nico suddenly shouted in a loud voice that startled both of us. She said that there was a ghost standing near the bed, reaching out to touch her. I didn't know if she was telling the truth, but to comfort and reassure her, I took a stick and pretended to chase the ghost away. But Nico also pointed at the wall and said that an old man was standing there staring at her. Even though I couldn't see anything, I still tried to pretend I did and hit the air with sticks just to calm her down. My daughter always mentioned that scary old man, so we had to coax a lot and hold her tight before she could sleep again. Nico has never said such strange things before, so my wife was a little worried, but I felt normal about it because she was still not used to the new place. The next day I told my mother about it, and she was so angry that she cursed the ghost violently. She did that partly to calm my daughter's fears. But ever since she cursed, Nico had been coughing constantly. My mother thought Nico might have been choking on food, so she patted her on the back and gave her some juice, but that didn't seem to work. Immediately my mother's expression changed and told us not to stay in that room anymore because she thought my grandfather was haunting Nico. The next day, on New Year's Day, my father and a few early uncles in the family went to visit the family's ancestral graves. My wife and Nico were at home alone. My family's ancestral grave occupied an area of most of the hill, and each grave is taken care of and worshipped during these New Year's holidays. Only one of my old grandfathers had overgrown weeds. No one wanted to sweep and trim the grass in front of the grave. When I arrived, I also heard my father scolding him very harshly. He scolded a lot and even threatened my grandfather to let go of my daughter and not to harm her. That scared me a bit. After we finished our work, we quickly went home. As soon as I entered the yard, my wife ran out in panic, saying that Nico had become very ill and had to be taken to the hospital earlier. She coughed continuously without stopping. Not only that, but also vomited a lot of thick black sputum. I was so worried, and I rushed to take my daughter to the district hospital for examination. Unexpectedly, she was diagnosed with tuberculosis by someone, an extremely dangerous and contagious disease. This news was like a thunderbolt. I wondered, how could this happen? How could a 3-year-old child get this disease? Moreover, there was no source of infection in my house, so this was quite absurd. Nico was hospitalized. She went under treatment for a few days but still did not improve. My wife and I were both worried and afraid. In the corridor of the hospital that day, I accidentally met one old uncle that I knew. He came to the hospital to see the doctor. He met me to talk privately and seemed a little hesitant about whether to talk to me or not. He said that Nico's appearance reminded him of my grandfather's condition before he died. He was afraid that Nico was possessed by my grandfather. Apparently, the more we cursed at him, the more damage he would do to Nico. So he told me to go to his grave to sincerely apologize and pay my respects, and then maybe Nico could be saved. I went home and told my parents the story. Even though they didn't like what I was about to do, they didn't object to me because it involved Nico's life. Right after that, I sincerely brought some incense to my grandfather's grave and paid him a visit. I knelt in front of the grave, trimmed the grass, and sincerely begged my grandfather to let Nico go because she was his great-granddaughter after all. She didn't do anything guilty. I also knelt to admit my mistake. I cried and begged not because I confessed my guilt or because I regretted something, but because I felt my Nico was too pitiful. I'd said all that could be said. I could only beg my grandfather not to haunt my daughter anymore. And the miracle happened. When I got back to the hospital, my baby Nico stopped coughing and was as healthy as ever. Just to be sure, I took her to the hospital in the big city for one more checkup, and the results this time showed that her lungs are exceptionally healthy and nothing was wrong. I don't know if it was a misdiagnosis from the previous hospital or because my prayers worked, but my daughter was fine anyway. Since then, it's been 3 years now, and I don't dare to bring her back to my hometown ever again.